Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about rest times and your gains. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright guys, well, we need to look at this from the perspective of both what is practical versus what do we know about the data, because I mean there can be some complexity there. But as far as what most of the scientific data shows about your gains, and that's with 3 Z's, is that contrary to all the myths that are out there, some of the various stuff that's been put out in personal training manuals, you go look at the stuff that people like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld and others have researched. What you generally find is that longer rest times equal better gains. Now, all the whole bodybuilding world will tell you, oh, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, all these different things, right? And because they're trying to accumulate metabolic fatigue, right? They're trying to accumulate metabolic fatigue. And some of it would be considered workload density, and I'll jump into that in a minute, but the truth is that actually doesn't seem to be true as far as gains go. In other words, cutting down rest times trying to get a better burn or more metabolic fatigue doesn't actually seem to give more gains, right? It doesn't seem to give more gains. Now, when we say something like that, that doesn't mean that a person can't get incredibly jacked with 60-second rest time. So that's kind of where we need to understand the nuance aspects of this. It's not that if you have longer breaks, you're going to gain twice as much muscle. It's a fairly small difference, right? We're not talking about 5 extra pounds a year or something crazy different here. So we get into some practical considerations as a result of that. But yes, it is possible for a person to take shorter rest periods and make really, really good gains. Doesn't mean they're not going to make the most gains possible, but they can make good gains. And if you can make good gains consistently for 3, 4, 5 years, you're going to get pretty close to your overall natural potential. So I don't want people to hear this when I say this and say, well, I know this person, or I personally did these shorter rest times and I gained a lot of muscle. No one's denying that. That's kind of like me saying that I think a pull-up is better than a lat pull-down, that it has more potential for muscle on you, and then someone saying, but I got a really big back and biceps and rear delts from doing lat pull downs, right? No one's saying that. So we need to understand what we're talking about here. But what the data generally shows is that resting as long as is required to replicate your first set usually produces more muscle growth. And what does that mean? It's usually like at least 3 minutes. It's at least 3 minutes. In other words, let's say you're training with your close to your 5 rep max or your 8 rep max or your 10 rep max, whatever it happens to be, right? And you stop about 1 rep short of failure. So let's say you're doing 3 sets of 8 and you're doing your 9 rep max. Well, if you stop 1 rep short of failure and you only rest 60 seconds, you are not going to be able to replicate that set. Usually, in other words, your 9 rep max is probably going to turn into around maybe a 7 rep max. And on your 3rd set, it might drop down to 6. So you're not going to be able to do 3 sets of 8. In other words, if you want to do 3 sets of 8, you're going to have to use a lighter weight. So what ends up happening is that what the data has generally found is that the rest times that allow you to lift as much weight as possible for all the sets for the given rep range produces the most muscle growth. In other words, doing 3 sets of 8 with 200 pounds, or 205, let's say, we'll go with nice round plate numbers. If you go with 205 on a bar, you can do 3 sets of 8 with it on an exercise. It will generally produce slightly more muscle growth than 3 sets of 8 with 185. Your rest times will determine what you have to do, because what ends up happening if you take shorter rest times, you either start really light, meaning light for the rep range you're using. In other words, if you're capable of doing 8 reps with long breaks at 205 and you do 185 for 8 reps, you're obviously not really getting as close to muscle failure, at least on the first set. And that's what a lot of this comes down to, is the total efficiency of your sets. Now, by that 3rd set, you might very well be reaching muscle failure. And so therefore, you got that one set that you got 4 or 5 quality reps in that stimulated muscle growth. But your earlier sets get shortchanged. So in other words, you're getting the least possible out of your 3 sets. In other words, you could be stimulating more growth with those same 3 sets because only your last set ended up really kind of fatiguing all those upper threshold fibers with a full 4 or 5 reps, because we know only about the last 5 reps stimulate growth. So what usually happens is that if you have to take the weight down slightly to complete all the sets with the shorter breaks, what ends up happening is that you get a little less muscle growth stimulated in the studies and the research that's looked at it, right? You get a little bit less muscle growth. And that also means obviously a little less strength because you're usually forced to use a slightly lighter weight on top of it. And, you know, size and strength, there is an enormous correlation there with a few other variables thrown in. So from a practical perspective, that isn't always true because here's what a lot of it comes down to. Yeah, ideally you should rest as long as you can get away with, as long as your time allows for it. Because if you can lift maximum weights, meaning maximum for your rep range for all of your sets, and you can use the heaviest weight possible for the full range of motion with good form, you're going to stimulate maximum size and strength out of your workout, right? But if you're having to reduce it, you're going to gain a little bit less. You're going to gain a little bit less. That doesn't mean in the grand scheme of things you won't gain a lot of muscle. And would you still be able to reach your potential eventually? Of course, because we have those diminished returns anyways with every month and year that you train. So from a research perspective and a data perspective, longer breaks absolutely make sense. They absolutely make sense. However, the point we get to comes to one of what's practical. And this is where individual people's needs have to be factored in. So it's kind of like people will say things like, well, everyone is different. Well, not in this regard, no. We're not different, but our lifestyles. How much time we're willing to spend in the gym, how much time we can afford to spend in the gym. You know, most people are not professional lifters who are out here listening. Most people who train aren't professionals. So then we kind of get into a dilemma of, let's say you only have an hour to train. Let's say you only have 45 minutes to train. So we get into the question of what is going to allow you to squeeze the most workload into that time. Because what we found is that workload density doesn't seem to be a factor in progressive overload. I used to say that, right? That, you know, your forms of progression are either adding weight to the bar, adding reps to a set, or adding more sets. And I used to say, you know, workload density, right? I'm talking about total workload in a shorter period of time. But here's what it comes down to. If you're shortening the rest times, you're reducing the other things. So in other words, if your workload density increases and you're able to do the same number of reps and sets with less rest time, you probably need to be doing more reps and have more weight on the bar because that means you're stronger than you thought you were. You're capable of performing better. And so to maximize on that, that's what you would need to do. Now, again, the problem we run into with that is that workload density actually isn't a good thing. It's not a good thing because that means that you're leaving weight off the table. You're leaving weight off the bar that you could be using. So it's not actually as effective as a form of progressive overload, because we know that adding more weight for the same reps and sets produces more gains, if assuming the form is the same, if you're not cheating the weight up. So the problem we run into, though, is that how much workload can you get done in the 45 minutes or hour or whatever you have? And that's the problem we run into, is that if you are on a very limited schedule, let's say you can only allocate X amount of minutes to a training session, and you want to get a certain amount of volume in, well, that's where you're going to have to really think about and manipulate these rest times, because maybe you can't rest 5 minutes between sets. Or if you do, you're going to have to run a more minimalist program. You're going to have to cut sets out. You're going to have to cut exercises out. And so then we get into the question of, do you have enough time to get in your minimum effective volume? Can you get in your minimum effective volume that you need to stimulate growth? Because muscle growth also requires not just a certain amount of tension, but there's a minimum volume and workload that you personally have to hit to disrupt your homeostasis of your body to stimulate more muscle growth. Well, that's where, again, it gets complicated. Not everyone has unlimited gym time. So in that case, a person's going to have to step down and say, okay, how long can I get away with resting between sets? And what is my the amount of workload that I personally have to do to continue to make progress? And what sort of rest times do I have to do in order to make this work into my time frame? Because maybe if you took 5-minute breaks, you can't get all the sets and all the exercises in that you need to get in. But if you can, it would probably be better to do less total work and go ahead and get those breaks in. But if you can't get enough in to stimulate growth, you're going to have to start shortening those rest times down at the expense of weight on the bar. But again, that comes down to individual minimum effective volume. It comes down to how much work you personally need to disrupt the homeostasis of your body to make more muscle growth, and what your personal schedule and time frame and even willingness to be in the gym allows for. Because maybe a person only wants to spend a certain amount of time in the gym and they value their rest and relaxation. So you're going to have to make a compromise there sometimes. So we could argue about what's optimal versus what may be practical for the individual. And so if you say, well, everyone's different and this works for me, well, it works for you might involve a compromise based upon your time and your schedule, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that it's ideal. It means that that's what works for your current life. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.